Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of Bhava Samvad of the Kalinga Literary Festival. We're very happy. I'm personally very happy to have Mr. Ashwin Sanghi, one of my favorite authors, here with all of us to have this conversation. This is the first time we're having Ashwin at KLF. Thank God for small mercies because, somehow the timings have not matched earlier with earlier editions, but this time, now that no one is traveling, so we are able to have Ashwin here. Um, you know, I'll tell you. So I'm sitting at the Bakul Library in Bhubaneswar. Now that's a library where I volunteer, and which has been entirely set up with book donations, people donating books, and not just this. We have set up more libraries, all set up with book donations, and I'm very happy, that we get a lot of books of Ashwin Sanghi as donations. This shows, how popular he is, how much people read. I don't know how many of you know.
Sujit,
Yes,
first of all, thank you for those lovely words about me. But also remember one thing: if a lot of my books are getting donated, it means that a lot of people possibly don't want to bother with them anymore and have donated them. So it can work both ways.
No, I would put it the other way around, Ashwini. What happens is many of our benefactors believe in sharing. I think that is the best thing. And I think, sometimes I thought about, the difference between an e-book and a physical book. And I see, though I'm not against, e-reading, but,
Yes.
this thing about the physical book which lends to sharing.
Of course.
And I'm sure you can imagine that given the fact that all our books are donated, each book carries a story which is beyond the story that is printed on the book.
Correct.
Like one of our volunteers cataloging a book found a book that was gifted at a wedding 20 years back, which she had attended in Kolkata.
Yeah. So there's a story behind the story.
Bilkul. And
Absolutely.
and I see it as, because the people who have been giving us books, they really want to share. So that is something I really like. But I don't know how many of the viewers here know that Chanakya's Chant by Ashwin was actually the highest selling book of 2010, because of which it won the Vodafone Crossword Award for the most popular book. But we won't talk about that. Ashwin, my first question, I'll straight away begin.
Sure.
And that is something that actually a very young volunteer of ours asked. Now, he said, I want to be a writer and I want to write mythology and I want to write a thriller in the genre of mythology and history. But my name does not begin with A. Do you think I'll do well? And then I realized, well, yes. Think about the genre of mythology and history and thrillers, and you think about Ashwin Sanghi, you think about Amish, you think about Anand Nilkantan.
Yes.
So does a person...
But then you also think
and he can't do anything. His parents had named him 20 years back.
But then you also think about Christopher Doyle, and you also think about Chitta Banerjee Divakurni, and you think about lots of other people who have made it very, very successfully in the world of mythological writing. But yes, those are probably the names that come to the top of your mind that, and given the fact that both Ashwin and Amish started out roughly around the same time, and we are more or less coinciding, ये जो पूरा जो mythological retelling का जो दौर शुरू हुआ 2007-2008 से, so pretty much we are part of that entire trend. So we tend to be talked about a little more. But I would say that, frankly, anyone who is planning to get into this space, first just sort of analyze one question, which is that are you getting into this space because it happens to be quote unquote hot? This is very important because for the longest time, people went into romance writing because Chetan Bhagat's novels had worked very well in that space.
And a lot of the campus romance particularly.
Exactly. So my only advice is that in case, for example, if Amish had not decided to go ahead and write Immortals of Meluha, or if Ashwin Sanghi had not decided to go ahead and write the Rosabal line, we wouldn't have ended up creating a fresh genre. So to my mind, there tends to be at times herd mentality in terms of, okay, ye bik raha hai and this is what is selling right now, so let's go and write in this space. by all means, if there is an interesting story, write in that space. But don't get into it simply because of the fact that that happens to be fashionable.
Definitely, definitely. But since you mentioned this, I mean, kahi to you must be feeling very good about the fact about being one of the inaugurators of this genre.
Frankly, I must tell you, Sujit, I never thought that I was creating a genre when I wrote the Rosabal line. I felt that this was a story which needed to be told. Most people are aware of the fact that I wasn't a writer when I sat down to write the Rosabal line. तब तक मैंने कोई भी फॉर्म की कहानी नहीं लिखी थी. इनफैक्ट
स्कूल में भी नहीं, कॉलेज में भी नहीं,
कुछ नहीं. स्कूल में मेरे जो प्रोफेसर थे वो कहते थे कि भाई तुम्हारा ग्रामर इतना खराब है, पंक्चुएशन इतना खराब है. एवरीथिंग वाज बेसिकली, आई वाज नॉट अ गुड राइटर. एंड when I visited Kashmir and I came to this particular tomb, जिसे कहते हैं द मकबरा ऑफ रोजाबाल, and then the driver who had taken me there, he told me कि शायद यहाँ पर जो गाड़े गए हैं वो हैं ईसा मसीह. It could be the possible resting place of Jesus Christ. And then suddenly, I don't know, a world opened up in front of me and I wanted to research that topic. And for the next couple of years, I devoted myself to reading everything that I could about that particular place and about the topic. And suddenly, the story came to me. So in that sense, I do believe that we don't go out looking for stories. Stories come looking for authors. And you will know when that story has come looking for you. So when I wrote it exactly the way it was coming to me. And I did not bother about whether it was publishable or not. It was only when I started getting rejections that people told me, what do you mean by theological thriller? What is a theological thriller? And that too, you are an Indian. Indians are expected to either write in the world of fiction, where you basically write family sagas or you write epics. Alternatively, if you are writing something which is in the world of books, then it's non-fiction, which will typically include a book on how to make the best biryani. I mean,
Tadla Dalal, of course,
what is logical thriller? Exactly. So, I mean, the point was that the concept of a theological thriller did not exist. It existed in the West because the Da Vinci Code had already come out by then. But the Rosabal line was completely new for the Indian publishing space. But had I thought that, no, how am I going to ever get published? Then I don't think that book would have been written. I think that is very important. Write a story because that story is inside you and it needs to be told. Don't worry about the genre in which that story is.
It's very interesting the way you said. It reminds me of that line by John Keats, who said, if poetry does not come like the leaves come to a tree, then it better not come at all. It sounds like
absolutely.
It sounds like that.
It's a natural process. It is such a completely natural process. So one doesn't really need to. Anu, tell him not to do this, please. Sorry about that, Sujit. No, it is a natural process where you need to figure out what is the overall excitement. Is this a story that is going to hold you for the next few months to be able to write it? Because after all, you'll have to live with that story for the next 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years. So will you be able to live with that story? Because if it is not exciting enough to live with it, then it's going to reflect in what you write. So my only advice to this gentleman, to this young man who has asked you, or this young lady who has asked you about, can I write a mythological thriller? I would say, of course, yes, you can. But only if that story is so exciting that you want to live with that story for the next 18 months.
You're possessed by it.
You're possessed by it.
No, but it's interesting because this is something I wanted to ask you about. Now, you came from a completely different background, as you also said. You've said earlier also, you had no inkling of wanting to be a writer, right? And presumably you had gone to Kashmir as a tourist. Was it as a tourist that you had gone, or on business?
No, what had happened actually, that was again, can I take 2-3 minutes to answer this, Sujit? I had gone there because a dear family friend of ours, his daughter was getting married, and this was at a time when militancy was still at a very, very high level in Kashmir, and
the early years of 2000.
This would have been probably around 2002 or so, and there were roadblocks everywhere, and the hotel where I was staying, which is now known, of course, as the Lalit, in those days it was known as the Oberoi Palace, and the main hotel was completely shuttered up. Only the annex, where about 10-15 rooms had been particularly made operational. अगर आप शाम को वो पैसेज में चलते थे तो खुद के जो footsteps थे उनका echo you could hear. So it was a very dark time, and what happened was that I attended the wedding, and then the next day the flight back from Srinagar to Delhi got cancelled, and that was a regular occurrence at that time. The flight schedules were getting changed, so I had a full day, and frankly I didn't want to be there because it was such a depressing atmosphere. So I told the driver, I said, मुझे कहीं ले चलो. I don't care where you take me, but just take me. He said, साहब अगर आप चाहें तो मैं शंकराचार्य ले चलता हूँ. I said, नहीं, शंकराचार्य के तो मेरे दर्शन ऑलरेडी बहुत बार हो चुके हैं. He said, अगर आप चाहें हजरत बाल चलते हैं. I said, हजरत बाल भी मैंने देख लिया है, चश्मशाही देख लिया है, दल लेक जा चुके हैं. So, because my family used to go very regularly to Kashmir almost every year. It was almost like a sort of a regular holiday destination for us. So then he said, नहीं साहब, एक जगह है जहां पर मैं आपको ले चल सकता हूं. And so we went there, and I didn't even know. He said, ये आप देखिए, ये जगह बहुत ही famous है. So I went there. It was very unassuming structure, very small little structure with a green colored roof, white walls. And outside there is a sign which is known as that there was someone called Yus Asaf who has been buried there, and there is a sarcophagus where the burial has taken place of a 13th century Muslim saint. His name is Nasiruddin. But what is fascinating is that there is a burial underneath that of Nasiruddin, which means, in other words, while Nasiruddin's head is pointing towards Mecca, the earlier burial, which goes back to the origin of the tomb, 124 AD, so almost 2000 years earlier, and that is a east-west burial. So that is how actually, for the first time, I suddenly realized, and outside the tomb, there is a carving which shows a pair of human feet with the little marks indicating where the nails for a crucifixion would have been hammered. So ये मतलब जिसे कहते हैं, इतनी दिलचस्प कहानी थी. It was so fascinating. I said, यार ये तो मतलब, this is a story that needs to be told. That is what I'm meaning. That when that story is there within you and you have to tell it, it's like wanting to go to the bathroom. Sujit, it's the morning you need to go to the goddamn bathroom.
With a full bladder.
Absolutely. That is the story that you need to tell. That is the story that you need to tell.
But there wasn't, apart from this experience that you had, this kind of enlightenment in a way, which, I mean, it's not enlightenment really, it's more like a puzzle, like which you wanted to, discover more about. And you went on the journey of exploration. But wasn't there any other moment of epiphany? Was Dan Brown's the Da Vinci Code a thing that, okay, yes, but for example, Dan Brown has himself said that, he was a musician and he started writing on a vacation in Tahiti where he read Sidney Sheldon's Doomsday Conspiracy.
Correct.
So for me, the Da Vinci Code in any way, did it have a role, or any other book?
I would say that probably even before Da Vinci Code, there was a book which was known as Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And that was the precursor to the Da Vinci Code. And that was a book which fascinated me because it talked about the possible bloodline of Jesus Christ. And then, of course, a few years later, the Da Vinci Code happened, and it was an instant global success and phenomenon. And of course, I read that book several times, not once. The Da Vinci Code is a book that I read several times. And I was just fascinated by that story. And luckily, having been exposed to Holy Blood, Holy Grail. But what happened was that the timing of that coincided with another book that I had read, which was a book called Jesus Lived in India, written by a German scholar called Holger Kirsten. And
Mhm.
all of these happened roughly around the same time. So that
But you
is how,
read those books before the Da Vinci Code
yes, because
because you're already been to Rosabelle Lane by
yeah,
then.
the linkages of Rosabal, etc., had already started playing on my mind. But then till then, no one had really written a thriller in this space. And then suddenly, when the Da Vinci Code happened, I realized, oh my God,
Wow.
I mean, I am learning so much just by simply reading something which is meant to be for entertainment. And that's the moment I realized that, listen, if it's a good book, then it has to do three things. And I call this the three E's. Uh, the first E is that it has to entertain. And I believe that that should account for 70% of what you do. Because if I can't entertain you, I will not be able to get you to turn the page, Sujit. The next E is what I call educate. That I think accounts for about 20%. That maybe when you read the book, you pick up on certain factual information which you were not aware of earlier. And you say, hey, listen, even though I was reading fiction, I think I'm slightly better educated because of having read this book. And the final E is by the time you reach the end of the book, you have that aha moment, that moment where you suddenly say, wow, why didn't I think of it this way? And I consider it to be the moment of enlightenment. And I think that is the third E, which accounts for probably about 10% of what you need to do. So it's a 70-20-10 rule: entertain, educate, enlighten.
And enlightened. But it's very interesting. Of course, this seems to be like a master class in writing as well. I didn't think it's going to turn out like this. But along with that, I'm just thinking, it's fascinating. When we think about all these the ifs and buts of history, like if Cleopatra's nose had been longer. Similarly, what if your plane had not been cancelled that day? You know, and you had not been.
Sujit, for a minute, I missed out on your question. There was a little bit of a break. So could
Yeah,
you repeat
sure.
that
I
question?
just repeat that. I'm saying that, we talk about the ifs and buts of history, like
Yes.
people speculate on Cleopatra's nose. And
Sure.
I'm just thinking, what if you had not missed your flight that day? What would have happened? I think we're all glad that the flight got cancelled.
So I am one of those who believes that we think that something is happening to us at a given moment, like you and I are talking at this moment, but there is a series of turns that we took, certain events that happened in our lives, certain decisions that we took, which made us come together at this given point of time. So it is a it's a probability map. It's very probable that we may not. It's very possible that I may have agreed to come on this particular show, and it's very possible that you may not have been available to interview me on this show,
Exactly.
and I could have been interviewed by someone else. Or alternatively, it could have been another day, in which case, again, our timelines could have clashed. Or it is possible that I could have completely said no, in which case this event would not have happened. So there are
Exactly.
so many probabilities that need to actually fall in place for certain things to happen. And I believe books are like that. It's almost the equivalent of Meri shadi hogi ki nahi? Will I marry the right person or not? Will I get the right job or not? Uh, Ask yourself, will I write the right story or not? Because it's as momentous. It's as momentous as producing a child.
Ah. No, I'll come to that. That begs me the question. What if a lot of people are developing apps these days? What if someone develops an app for like a Tinder app for a writer and his story? I don't know, but we'll come to that later. But were you much into reading thrillers earlier, or that was also you were an avid reader earlier?
I was an avid reader, and the reason I was an avid reader was not because of me, but primarily because of two people in my life. One was my maternal granduncle. Uh, his name was Ram Gopalji Gupta, and he lived in Kanpur. And he wasn't my Nanaji, but my Nanaji's elder brother. And even though he was a very well-to-do businessman, but he always used to tell me that, beta, if you are born in a business environment, then you are taught to worship Lakshmi. But frankly, he said Lakshmi is tends to go wherever Saraswati happens to be. So he said, never forget that relationship between Lakshmi and Saraswati. And he said that your short way of being able to get Lakshmi is by going after Saraswati. So he said, वो हर वक्त अपने जहन में अपने ध्यान में रखो कि सरस्वती माँ की पूजा करो. एंड ही सेड एक चीज याद रखो कि जब सरस्वती और लक्ष्मी साथ में विराजमान हो जाते हैं तो उनके बीच में विराजमान होते हैं गणेश जी. सो ही सेड लिव योर लाइफ लाइक गणेश. He said that is the ideal world where you have Lakshmi on one hand and you have Saraswati on the other. And that's why I like to joke that probably one of the reasons why Ashwin Sanghi looks the way he does is because his life is modeled on Ganesh. But on a more serious note, Nanaji used to, from Kanpur, he would send me one book every week to read. And he would say that, beta, isko padho. Isse shayad tumko kuch milega. And as a result of which, what happened was that over his lifetime, he shared a little over 300 to 400 books with me of all types. But Nanaji's choice collections were slightly different. I mean, in the sense that at a very young age, I got books like the Mahabharata retold by Raja Gopalchari, or the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahans Yoganand, Freedom at Midnight by Dominique Lapierre. So it was a mixture of history, mythology, philosophy, religion, culture, science. So it was an eclectic mix of books that came to me. But in parallel, what was happening actually, Sujit, was that my mother was also a voracious reader. But my mother was not into what we would consider to be deep or meaningful type of reading. She was in it for entertainment. So the latest Jeffrey Archer or Sidney Sheldon or Robert Ludlum or Frederick Forsyth or Tom Clancy or what have you, she would read it and then she would pass it on to me. So I had these two streams of books coming at me. One was the more meaningful reading, which was which I loved. Yeah, it was stuff that I loved for the content. But there was also the other stuff that was coming to me from mom, and that was stuff which I loved for its style and its pace and its the fact that you wanted to turn the page. So as a result of which, I think most of my books in the Bharat series, I try to amalgamate those two styles, that where the content tends to be a little more philosophical, a little deeper, a little more scientific, but the pace and the method of telling it is as entertaining as possible.
What a heady combination. Now the dots actually connect, because I was actually wondering, when I look at your writings, there seems to be such a diverse arenas of knowledge that you seem to be straddling. And it is not just geography, continents, it's also time across centuries, ancient, medieval, more contemporary, recent, past. But also there's history, there's mythology, there's science, there's biology, there's so much, I mean...
I think, Sujit, one of the authors that I really respect and regard was the author Arthur Haley. And he operated at a time when we did not have Google Baba. So if you were writing, I mean, if you look at some of those books, whether it was The Money Changers or Hotel or Airport or so many other bestsellers of Arthur Haley, he went into so much detail on a topic where you did not have the concept of internet did not exist. And this was all first-hand collected information. So, to a very great extent, I would consider myself to be someone who has been deeply inspired by the value of research. There is let's face it, at heart, Sujit, we are all, what are we as storytellers? I mean, we are spinners of yarns. Um, uh, when
You called
I
yourself a liar. You said that you're all liars in a
बिल्कुल
sense.
बिल्कुल हम कहानियां बनाते हैं तो but in order to be able to tell that lie we have to do the research. We have to create a bedrock of research in order to make that lie far more believable,
Believable.
because the story has to be believable, and that is where your research comes in. So I think to a certain extent it is not just the years of receiving books from both Nanaji as well as mom, but it is also about the fact that now when I sit down to write a story, I invest a lot of time on the research, a lot of time.
So, this is something I would have come to you a little later, but, but since we have talked about it, you've already talked a bit about the beginning of Rosable line, and you've talked about, the process where, because this was something that was coming very curiously to me, because given the fact that you are again covering so many diverse, terrains of knowledge,
Sure.
and which requires so much research. So first novel was an accident, let's say,
Yes.
in a way, because you went to the
No,
shrine and then,
you hit the nail on the head. It was a bloody accident. Absolutely.
yeah. But then, how did the subsequent novels happen? I mean, would you sometimes you talk about how for you the newspaper is a very important space,
Sure.
but then, so do you get ideas? Do you park them while you finish the novel that you're currently working on, or how do you know which areas you're going to use, or is it just organic? Is it just organic as the ideas come? I,
No.
I get that probably the ideas come organically to you, because that's what you said. Something
Yes.
has to grip you. So that
Yeah.
initial something you've read or something. So maybe
Absolutely. I
could you
think
just tell a little more about the process?
I
Maybe two
think
other novels.
you've partly answered my question. The ideas do come organically, and the way it works really is that most of us get great ideas when we are not planning to write a book, or make a movie, or write a column. So we get the idea, but the idea has come and it's gone, and we've not captured it. So for me, I think one of the most important part of what I do is to capture ideas as and when they come. And I have a unique and novel way of doing it, which is to email myself. If we are having this discussion today, it's very possible that during the course of this discussion, there will be two questions that emerge, which may completely, jise kehte hain, batti on type of situation where you say, "Arey, how did Sujit think of it this way?" And then, rather than letting that idea go, I will actually email myself that this was an interesting question that arose, and it is worth considering. So this is very important, whether it is a book that I'm reading, or I could be passing by on a particular street and I see a particular site which I need to capture on my phone, and I will email the pic to myself, or I could be watching a YouTube video and I email the link to myself. So over the years, I've emailed myself a little over 10,000 times, which are basically ideas
And
that
that
have
is and that works for you better than making notes, say on a
absolutely.
Word document or anything.
Absolutely. So this is one part of it, which is idea capture. The second part of it really is that when you're sitting down to write a novel, at that point of time, what will happen is that there will be a trigger. So you have lots of ideas that you could possibly work on, but something that will happen which will be a trigger. In the case of Rosabal, it happened because of the visit to Rosabal and that idea emerging at that point of time. With Chanakya's chant, the idea emerged in the 2009 elections, where it took a long time for government formation. And I wondered to myself, I said, is politics, has it always been so messy? When we talk about old times, we talk about the good old days, but really, were the good old days really good? And so the thought was the politics of 2,300 years ago the same as the politics of today? And that's how Chanakya's chant was born. The Krishna key was a chance meeting with someone who unfortunately on that particular evening was substantively inebriated and believed that he was the 10th incarnation of Vishnu. And I'm not too sure whether he believed it for himself or whether he was trying to make a dramatic statement, but that emerged during the discussion. And I said, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if there was such a person who really believed that he was the 10th incarnation, the Kalki Avatar, and thought of his duty as basically the duty of cleansing the world of all evil. So that's how the Krishna key was born. So
And this guy, this actual guy you met,
yes,
was also a murderer?
No, obviously not. No, obviously not. Or at least I don't know whether he is. But no, I mean, the point is that it sort of got my juices going in terms of this would make for an interesting take on the story. The latest book, The Vault of Vishnu, was at a roadside stall drinking tea, and I thought to myself, I said, "Isn't it amazing?" I mean, because the tea stall guy said, "Ki sahab, aap chini kam lenge ya chini maar ke दूं?" And I was wondering, ye chini maar ke kya hota hai? And then I thought to myself, the word chai is also originating from China, and chini also comes to us from China. So I said, isn't this relationship interesting? Let's talk about this relationship and how many thousands of years of exchange of ideas and materials and goods and philosophies and religions have happened between India and China. And that's how the Vault of Vishnu was born. So, I mean, there will be always a trigger. And that, again, is not necessarily a very organic process. And then, of course, once that trigger has happened, then ultimately it's a question of getting your research and plotting and all of that, which I have explained on several occasions what my process is. So most of your viewers would already have heard that before in terms of what is the process that I follow.
Sure. So all of these were like emails to yourself, like this meeting with that inebriated person, the
Absolutely.
reflection over the chai.
Absolutely. But then it was not just that. But for example, when that, when I looked at that particular inebriated individual, I had already emailed myself in advance about things like Kalki. I had emailed myself about the possibility that the Mahabharat could have been a nuclear war. I had emailed myself earlier about the drying up of the river Saraswati. So there were multiple emails already in my data bank about topics that were close to my heart. And they all made their way into the Krishna key eventually.
I think, like Steve Jobs has his famous talk, connecting the dots. I think you should actually have, talk about connecting the dots. It seems to work out like that.
Absolutely. In fact, I do a rather interesting presentation at many management institutes and all of that, which is called Connecting the Dots. And it is primarily about how one can actually use, because Steve Jobs, since you mentioned him, he had a very interesting take. He said, creativity is just about connecting things. When you talk to creative people and ask them how they did something, they wonder as to why what they have done is so great, because actually they saw something and they connected the dots.
It was that obvious, yeah.
It was that obvious. So, and that's pretty much what I do when I'm writing my books, because I find lots and lots of dots, but suddenly then I find that I can see connections between them. So, for example, in the Rosabal line, for me, something as simple as the word Abraham and dropping the A from the beginning of Abraham and putting it at the end, giving me the word Brahma instead. For me, that is a connection. Or the fact that Abraham has a wife called Sarah, but Brahma's consort is Saraswati, that becomes for me a connection. Or the idea that you have a male trinity, which is of Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, and a female trinity of Lakshmi, Saraswati, Kali. And if I represent them as two triangles, which are overlapping one another, then I get a 6-pointed star, which resembles the Star of David. And then I'm wondering as to whether that Star of David has another connection back to India. And then I suddenly find that the doors of Somnath have that same Star of David on them, which were carried off by Ghazni and which are now at Ghazni's tomb. So, I mean, for me, those connections are what excite me. I mean, so yes, you've summed it up beautifully. It's all about connecting the dots.
Okay, thank you. Since you mentioned Vault of Vishnu, your latest novel, again, very ambitious in terms of scope, centuries, geographies, etc. And also new kind of, talking about bioengineering and all. Because we are from Odisha, and there's a Kalinga connection. I mean, we all know about Kalinga's strong relations with Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia, and the role that we had. I was wondering if you came across, you do a lot of extensive research, and so anything interesting that you have found about Odisha? Because the little that I know, there is, of course, you seem to have, subscribed to the theory, the popular theory of a Pallava, king who went, someone who went from here and then became the first king of Cambodia.
Yes.
But then there is, which is also a theory which has been disputed by people like H.B. Sarkar and others. There is another theory, I don't know if you're aware of that, I'm sure you are, of the Kaundinyas going from Odisha, Kalinga.
Absolutely.
And there is the Kaundinya sect of Brahmins still in the Mahendragiri Parvat. And they say that, the Jayavarman II was supposed to have ascended the throne at Mahendra Parvat in Cambodia. So anything about the Kalinga connection that you have discovered in your research that you'd like to talk about?
No, the Kalinga connection, in fact, to a certain extent, does come across even in the Vault of Vishnu, because, for example, when I'm talking about the travelogue of Hyun Sang, I talk about him having come through Kalinga, and I talk about him having stood at the great port and seeing the twinkling lights and wondering as to whether he was seeing the lights of Sinhala, and then realizing that Sinhala is too far away for him to be expecting that those are the lights from there. So there is a lot of stuff which comes across in the travelogue. But to a very great extent, this problem that you've talked about in terms of alternative theories, I have heard this alternative theory, the Kaundinya part of it. But the problem that arises, Sujit, is that whenever we are writing in the world of fiction, we unfortunately have to simplify things to a point where we can't make you aware of all the alternative theories exist. So typically, I always find myself cherry picking that what works better for my story. Because my job is not that of a scholar or a historian.
Not to write history.
Yeah, or to say that there are three different versions of this particular story. Let me give you an example. When I'm writing the Krishna Key, there are accounts of, for example, what was the land on which, let's say, the Taj Mahal was located, and was there an earlier structure called Tejo Mahalya on that particular land, and did that land belong to Raja Mansingh? Now, there are at least 5 different versions that we know of in terms of the construction of the Taj Mahal. I can't present them all. I can only take up one of them, put them into the book. But what I do is that I try and provide you with all the alternative sources towards the end of my book, which is in the acknowledgement section, in the bibliography section. You will normally find that even the contrary viewpoint to what I have presented will be there, so that the idea being, because I've always thought of my books as more or less an exploration, a journey. So if that topic interests you enough, then I'm assuming that you'll want to go back into the sources. And when you'll go back into the sources, then you'll probably find that, there is that there are some alternative theories that have been presented there. So that's what I hope that a large chunk of my readers would end up doing.
No, that of course I completely understand, because I mean, that is also not the only story that you're telling, right? Because that is part of your larger story. There are actually multiple stories that you're putting together,
And not
As
only
you said,
that, but to a very great extent, I feel that one of the huge gaps is this whole Southeast Asia gap, and in which obviously Kalinga plays a very, very critical role. But the whole Southeast Asia, what? How should I call it? Almost that uh, the the exchange of goods, information, ideas that was happening between South India, Eastern India, Southeast India, as well as Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Java, and the rest of it.
Indonesia.
Tremendous. And I think that is one of the least explored areas, frankly. In that sense, I'm grateful to people like Sanjeev Sanyal, who have taken up these topics and have tried to bring them into the popular discourse. But I believe that there are many, many exciting stories of that nature which need to be told. Uh, we only understand Kalinga from the point of view of the great battle of Ashoka. Let's face it.
Yeah,
That is the limitation. You mentioned Kalinga, and that's what people understand of Kalinga. But I believe that probably there must be at least 2 or 3 budding writers who are listening to this particular talk between you and me, and hopefully this will become an impetus for them to be able to take up Kalinga a little more seriously.
definitely, definitely. I'll just move from here to something because I was just seeing that probably we would like to have some time for questions. So there were a few other questions I wanted to ask, but let me jump to something else. That typically when one writes popular fiction, and particularly as thrillers, as you said, you have to choose something that seems to work for the story, something that grips. You've also said, like, you begin with something like a murder in the beginning,
Oh yeah,
something that
sure.
makes you want to read beyond that. Now, but this is always a danger or risk that one runs in any kind of popular culture, whether it is popular fiction or popular cinema, that in order to be popular, one often, feels that one has to play to the gallery in terms of reproducing certain stereotypes, reproducing, certain cultural prejudices. I'll just tell you where I'm coming from. For
Sure.
instance, when COVID happened,
Yes.
everyone was suddenly, it got viral, this page from Dean Koontz's novel Eyes
Sure.
of Darkness, where he talked about Wuhan, the Wuhan lab, and everyone said, conspiracy theory. You think of conspiracy theory and it is always prejudice. And when I actually read up on it, and I was also struck, I said, how the hell did he think of it? And then when I read up on it, I realized that when it was published in 1981, it was actually called the Gorky Lab, because that it was the era of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the US were enemies. And of course, in any popular fiction, popular cinema, like all the Rambo movies, from the time the Rambo movie was released, which was the primary enemy of the United States at that time.
That's right.
Right. So similarly, and in 1989, when Dean Koontz's novel was republished, then it became Wuhan Lab, because the Cold War had ended and China was. So from this context, have you felt this fear, or have you tried to negotiate, had an anxiety about the possibility of, because you're talking about the Lashkar-e-Taiba, you're talking about China with the kind of tensions that are there. So do you have that anxiety that you may be reproducing prejudices as you are writing popular fiction?
Not really. I'll tell you why. Because to a certain extent, my approach has always been that what I do is I utilize subjects such as history, mythology, theology, philosophy, science, geography, anthropology, and various other disciplines in order to construct uh, what I would consider to be the skeleton of a building. So uske jo columns and beams hain, that is what I construct using all of these various factoids. And then after that, I'm free to be able to fill in the brick and plaster within that entire skeleton of the structure. And that is where my fiction is. Now, obviously, when I'm constructing the framework, at that point of time, I'm bound to be influenced by what is going on in global affairs. There's no way that I cannot be. So, for example, in Keepers of the Kal Chakra, there is a backdrop of Islamic radicalism, and Islamic terror is a sort of running thread through Keepers of the Kal Chakra, even though it is fundamentally about quantum theory. So the point I'm making is that for us to expect that the writer of a given time can be completely independent and devoid of what is going on in the world, that is living in la la land almost, because it's there in front of you. It's playing out on the news. It's playing out in the newspapers. You're hearing it on TV. It's there as part of popular culture. And I mean, even when I look back at, let's say, the Rosabal line is, before the event happened of 26/11. The Rosabal line talks about a boat being captured off the coast of Gujarat and being used to transport terrorists into India. And that happened, unfortunately, before 26/11. And later on, people said, hey, listen, you foretold that something was going to happen. But the truth of the matter is, I foretold nothing. All history and politics is about patterns, and those patterns repeat themselves periodically. And so, very often, for example, I mean, the same thing happened with the Vault of Vishnu, because I start off with a skirmish between India and China happening in Doklam. Now, the point is that today now there is a skirmish which happened a few months ago at Galwan and other places. So people say, "Oh, Ashwin foretold this." There have been thousands and thousands of skirmishes that have happened. So I have not done something unique. I've simply picked up an event which happened probably 10 years, 20 years, 50 years ago, and I have retold it in my way. So in that sense, I believe that there is an interplay between fact and fiction. Fact influences us fiction writers, and sometimes, unfortunately, we fiction writers also tend to influence fact. So, for example, probably if, let's say, a movie franchise like Star Wars had not happened, maybe you might have found that space exploration may not have necessarily reached the level that it did. So
Definitely.
there is an interplay between the two. There is an interplay. As far as conspiracy theories go, Sujit, to my mind, at least what I think of a conspiracy theory is that it fills that gray zone for those events for which we don't yet have logical answers. So for example, who really assassinated John F. Kennedy? We don't have a clear answer. So therefore, it lends itself to speculation, and that becomes the realm of conspiracy. Or how did Subhash Chandra Bose really die? And so, because we don't have a clear answer on that, that's the reason why, and that becomes a very delicious sort of space for all types of theories to function. That question is actually a rather delicious question. It's two words: what if? What if this happened, or what if this did not happen? And it lends itself to the sort of novels that I write.
In fact, it's interesting because the what if is also the phrase I used to describe, what if you had not missed your flight, which made you a writer.
Exactly.
But talking about conspiracies, of course, for all of us, the big theory is, of course, Sushant Singh Rajput. Does it fascinate you? Is that something that there's something there that you might want to write about?
No, I mean, somehow or the other, the one thing that I'm not by very nature is I'm not voyeuristic. So there is a certain voyeuristic tendency which we have these days related to individuals.
Celebrities.
By the way, I was the Sushant Singh Rajput situation did affect me in a certain way, because prior to this event, he had reached out to me because of Keepers of the Kal Chakra. So that was a book that he had read and had really appreciated. So that had happened because he was a man who was in love with physics. He was in love with quantum theory. He was in love with the overlap between spirituality and quantum theory. So in that context, yes, that particular bit was of some relevance to me. But beyond that, honestly, Sujit, to my mind, the bigger questions of life uh, fascinate me far more. That, for example, were our rishis really looking into the stars, and were they able to discern the speed of light without any modern astronomical instruments? That is far more exciting to me. Or, for example, does the Rig Veda actually contain a shlok which talks about the speed of light? Um, that is fascinating to me. Or the possibility that Jesus could have come to India and could be buried at Rosabal. That is exciting to me. Or the fact that maybe the linkages between the Zoroastrian faith and the Hindu faith are related to a single people who diverged because of the drying up of the river Saraswati. That becomes exciting to me. But individual Bollywood type stories uh, don't
They don't
excite me that
really.
much. Don't excite me that
But
much. And but
but on
yes,
those,
sorry, from the point of view of simply telling a story, probably there are other authors who might be excited by that entire setup where politics meets Bollywood, where murders and suicides are happening, and
I
where
mean,
there is drug
classic
cartel.
conspiracy
Yeah,
theory.
yeah. So
But
yeah,
given the times that we are in, personally for me also, it
sure,
has been a discovery of how pandemics have had so much impact on our own lives in history across centuries, which personally I had not discovered. There's so little that we hear about the role of disease in history
right.
and all of that. And given the fact that pandemics also lead to conspiracy theories, they are like
Yes,
fertile soil for conspiracy theories.
of
Whether
course.
it is blaming the Jews for poisoning the wells for the Black Death, or the
Right.
Tablighi Jamaat,
Yes.
in COVID here. Uh, does this pandemic make you run to the bathroom?
Uh, the pandemic in and of itself, I have always maintained that, for example, one for me, it's never about one particular thing. Like, for example, it's not about the suicide of a Bollywood actor or his possible potential murder, or, for example, the pandemic that has happened,
No, but
but the
pandemics have
possibility.
been happening in history.
Yeah, so
It has had
the
major
but
roles.
the correlation of this pandemic with, let's say, tomorrow, if there was a hypothetically, if there was a prophecy related to this particular pandemic, and
An ancient prophecy.
an ancient prophecy which talked about this particular pandemic that has happened, and I'm not talking about the WhatsApp forwards which attribute everything to Nostradamus. I mean, I'm talking about a little more serious research which indicates that something has happened. Or alternatively, in case the pandemic was related back to something which has genuinely happened as a result of a science experiment gone wrong. Uh, where I see overlaps, those are the places where I want to tell my stories, not individual isolated events as of themselves.
Sure. Yeah, I was just curious, given the fact that, because for me, the pandemic opened up a whole history and a lot of other things, interconnections. Even there was a connection that I discovered about Hitler and seeing himself as a plague doctor when he was
Okay.
doing his final solution.
Okay.
So I hope it goes to into your email. But yes,
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot more that we can go on talking about, but I think we'll take questions now from the audience. I'm sure many of your avid fans and readers have a lot of questions. So, uh, so let's see. There's a comment from Navajyoti that to understand Kalinga from Kalinga War. But yes, unfortunately, that is all that a lot of us get to know. Even people staying in Odisha, most children, that's the only thing. If they're going to, schools in which the syllabus is determined nationally, whether it's an
Yes.
ICSE or CBSE. That is
Yes.
all that they would know. Do we have any other questions? Sorry, Ashwin, you want to respond to
No,
this?
all I'm saying is that to a very great extent, I think even something as mainstream as the war itself, even if we consider that we only know Kalinga through that war, but the only narrative we have is of that, the way we want to understand the narrative of that war. So, to my mind, I mean, what is the narrative we have? That, well, there was this great emperor. His name was Ashoka, and he did the Kalinga War, and in that, lakhs of people died, and in the process, the rivers turned red because of the blood that flowed, and eventually, he was completely heartbroken as a result of the number of lives that he had taken, and he turned to Buddhism for greater inner peace. Now, the point is, that's great. That's one story. But I believe that the alternative stories have not been adequately explored. That, was he genuinely a Buddhist at the time when the war took place? Was he a Buddhist before, or was he a Buddhist later? Or is there a political dimension to the way that narrative has been spun? So there are many, many things where I believe the nuances have been lost down the ages. And I really do. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'll just tell you, I'm sorry, but you have tempted me to make it into your emails. So there's something else that I'll share.
Oh.
One of the questions that interestingly bothered me, and not just me, it's something that I read somewhere, is the mystery about who was the king of Kalinga. And
Yes.
why is it a mystery? Because Ashoka in all his edicts talks about who he defeated.
Yes.
And this was supposed to be the most famous war that he
Correct.
fought, but there is
Correct.
no mention of the opponent, the king on the other side.
Oh.
And there have been different theorizations. I'll tell you my personal take on it.
Yes.
My personal story,
Yes.
theory about it is that probably it became such a bloody war because there was no one king, but
Yes.
Kalinga was a confederation of small kingdoms.
Correct.
Which is why then killing the one king does not end the war. You have to go on. And that has been the story of Odisha. Even
Yes.
now, when we became independent, the country became independent, apart from British India part of Odisha, there were a lot of these what we call Garjats. Gad
Yes.
is like a small fort, hill kingdoms, these small kingdoms. And that apparently had been the case always.
Correct. And probably in some ways, that would have also been a challenge to the way that the Mauryan Empire was run, because if you could run it as a confederacy of some sort, then probably having a centralized empire, which is operated out of Patliputra, or any very, very strongly centralized kingdom, the way Kautilya envisaged it, would have been very difficult, and would have been seen also as a threat to the power structure. It's all, it's
Exactly.
a different way of running a kingdom. So I think these are the nuances which have not got picked up on, and I really hope that tomorrow's storytellers will not only look at taking our epics. I mean, why go far? Even the references of Kalinga within the Mahabharata itself. So I think there are so many dimensions which need to be explored. Well, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, when you take me in a certain direction, I have a tendency to drag
No,
on there.
please go on. No, please go on. I don't know if. Please finish. Yeah.
No. The point I'm making is that to a very great extent, I think, popular culture allows one narrative, one version to become the so-called gospel truth, and that is where I have a problem, because even with, I mean, that very nature of what we call the gospel truth means that the gospels are truth. And unfortunately, we also know that even if we were to take the four gospels of the New Testament, there are huge variations between the narratives of the four gospels. And that is not taking into account all the Gnostic gospels which were declared as blasphemous by the Catholic Church. The same applies when we take our own Indian epics. We have 300 versions of the Ramayana, and each version of the Ramayana tells you a relatively different story. So the point I am trying to make is simply this, that for the longest time, I think the greatness of India has been the fact that we allowed multiple narratives to flourish. And just because there was a point of distinction between, let's say, the Valmiki Ramayana and the Ramcharitmanas, or between the Ramcharitmanas and the Adbhut Ramayana, or the Adbhut Ramayana and the Anand Ramayana, or the Anand Ramayana and the Lao Ramayana, we didn't say that my truth makes your truth negated. We could have multiple truths coexisting. And that is the very essence of dharmic philosophy, that you can have 33 million deities and they can lead to a universal truth. You can be an astic or a nastic. You can be a Shaivite or a Vaishnavite. You can believe in God. You can not believe in God. You can be a vegetarian. You can be a carnivore. You can be a fire worshipper. You can be a nature worshipper. You can be a sun worshipper. You can be a cow worshipper. It doesn't matter. Or you want to be no worshipper. You want to be astic, nastic, tantric, whatever. It doesn't matter. I think that is the essence which we now need to bring about. And the more stories that we can narrate, and the more dimension, the multi-dimensionality that we can bring into our storytelling narrative, it will help only reinforce that idea. That is where
I think it's very good that you made this point, about the plurality of narratives. There being no one, master narrative, and that is something that everyone really needs to, somewhere. Many people, in fact, someone I know had messaged me. Please ask him a question about
Yes.
the Hindutva co-option. That so there's an assumption
Yes.
that that when a person is writing mythology, or you are necessarily
Yes.
falling into that trap. But what I find interesting, and I've had these conversations earlier with Amish and with Anand also, and all
Yes.
of you seem to be, if you go deeper into mythology, the better you know how the plurality of narratives exist, that there is no one
There
master
isn't.
mythological text.
There isn't. And I think that is the greatness of this country, that we need to keep pushing. And I've always believed that that is one of the major departure points between the dharmic way of doing things and the Abrahamic way of doing things. The Abrahamic way of doing things is that there is a single God, that if you do not worship that single God, then you will be damned in the hellfires of eternity. Whereas the view of the dharmic view has always been that, hey, listen, even if you decide to worship Jesus Christ, I can put Jesus Christ on the face of my temple and I can still be a Hindu. So the point is that I can co-opt. You create a religion called Buddhism. Well, I can make Buddha into the ninth incarnation of Vishnu. I mean, so the point is that we can absorb, and I think that has been the greatness of our country. And I believe that to a very great extent we have a moral and a greater debt to this country to be able to bring out all of these stories. I think
Absolutely.
I'm not fascinated by what is commonly accepted, Sujit. I mean, we have, in modern history, we have an event in 1857 which is called the Great Rebellion of 1857. That same event in England is taught as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Again, what are we talking about? Different perspectives, different narratives. And frankly, 90% of the kids go through the UK educational system without even knowing what the colonial horrors that England perpetrated on the rest of the world. So the point is that I think what we want is that we want more of these stories to be told. We want more of these stories to flourish. And I'm not saying that my truth must become the sole truth. I want 10 other truths, and I'm willing to give them equal credence.
Exactly. I mean, it's great actually to end on this note. And it's a very emphatic point that you're making. And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to talk about it also, because when I talk to people also, I try and emphasize on this point that please let us allow the plurality of narratives, to exist. But since you talked about the colonial education, what I also find very troubling, and personally when I reflected on my own education also, as to how uncritically had taken something like India was discovered by Vasco da Gama, as if we didn't know each other. We were ignorant of our own existence till Vasco da Gama came and discovered us, or Columbus came and discovered America.
So what are we again talking about? We are talking about the fact that we've learned history through the white man's narrative.
Exactly.
Similarly, for example, for hundreds and thousands of years, we said, well, there is Itihas, which is the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and we have the Purans, which are basically our more deeper spiritual insights through the world of fantasy and fiction. But suddenly the white man came along and said, no, the Mahabharata and Ramayana is not Itihas. It is not history. It's your epics. And we fell in line with that. We fell in line with the Aryan invasion theory. Then later on, we had to
become the Bible.
Then we had to tone it down, and or for example,
the Gita becoming our holy book.
Sorry,
the Gita becoming our holy book.
So, I mean, the where I'm simply coming from, Sujit, is that to a very great extent, history is always presented. I can see my dear friend Ramendra Kumar also on this on the chat screen, and he says history is the story of the victor. But it was Napoleon who turned around and said, "What is history but a fable that has been agreed upon?" It was the playwright and novelist George Santayana who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. So in that sense, history is a version of events. So I think we as mythological fiction writers or historical fiction writers are able to take far greater liberties with the way we want to present our stories, and hopefully we are helping in terms of being able to give you a 360-degree view in terms of what could have possibly happened. If I may take 2-3 minutes more, take the story of Chanakya and Kautilya. I mean, our history books, the narrative of Chanakya, while he wrote many books like the Arthashastra and the Niti Shastra, but very little was written about Chanakya. So our version of Chanakya's life story comes to us from a Sanskrit play, which is known as the Mudra Rakshas. And the Mudra Rakshas was written by Vishaka Datta almost about 700 years after Chanakya had passed away. Now imagine something, Sujit, supposing that you and I, we are today talking, but someone writes up our stories 7 centuries later. How much of it will be fact and how much will be fiction? So can we say that maybe Vishaka Datta was an ancient day Ashwin Sanghi or an Amish Tripathi liberally taking little bit mighty, mixing in their fiction with it and presenting a narrative? Because after all, Mudra Rakshas was meant to be presented on stage as a theatrical production. So I'm sure he would have taken liberties in terms of presenting the story. But today, our historical narrative of Kautilya comes to us from the Mudra Rakshas. So the point I'm making is that we need to take history with not a pinch of salt, but a bag of salt. Well, anyway, sorry.
Yeah,
you got me started.
Definitely. Just to rephrase what Ramendra ji said, that's my favorite line. The movie Braveheart begins with the line, "History is written by those who hang the heroes." I found that to be very powerful. But then thank you so much, Ashwin, for being here and for such a wonderful and forthright discussion that we had on so many insightful topics that took us into your mind, into how you work, how you write, and also your perspective on many things that your readers now got a good view into. So thank you very much. Anything you would like to say to the viewers before we sign off?
Honestly, all I want to say to your viewers is that use this time effectively, because you may look back on this time as probably a life-changing time. For me, at least, it is, because I've realized what is important to me in my life. I've suddenly realized the value of things that are important to me. So stay happy, stay safe, stay healthy. God bless all of you. But use the time effectively, because ultimately, what is it was, I think, Chanakya who said that uh, uh, with all the gold in the world, you cannot buy the moment of time that has already gone by. So utilize it effectively, because you may find that these were the most precious moments.
Thank you so much. And from all our viewers, may Lakshmi and Saraswati be at your side always.
Thank you, Sujit. Thank you for doing such a
Thank you.
wonderful job. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.